2. What events in the history of humanity brought us from part 1 to part 2?
There are 4.
4.
One is Protestant Reformation.
Yes.
Discovery of America.
Yeah.
Discovery of America. Yeah.
Scientific revolution.
Scientific revolution. Humanism and Renaissance. Humanism and Renaissance. What is humanism and Renaissance?
Humanism was more of a cultural movement, while Renaissance was more of a political movement.
Yeah, very good. And what is this movement about? Humanism. What is humanism about?
At that time, the focus was in Christianity, so they tend to put the picture on the human beings, and they went back to the early Greeks to study that and to make it again.
Exactly. So, I have 4 movements. The first one is humanism and Renaissance. Humanism means we restart putting the human being at the center of our thinking, of our actions, of our speculation. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, the focus was on God, not on the human being. If you look at the great, what did we do during the Middle Ages? Beautiful things, beautiful. We had the best painting in the history, Giotto, for example, or even Antonello da Messina here. So we have beautiful things, but all these things were about God. They paint Jesus Christ, they paint the Madonna, beautiful things, but the subject is always something holy, it's always religious subject. Is religious art, beautiful art, but religious. With the humanism, we start focusing on human being. Let's see one very famous painting that is somehow embodying the humanist Renaissance movement. Okay, you can see, but you know this painting, right?
Yeah.
No? Venere di Botticelli. Venere di Botticelli, okay? So Venere di Botticelli is, somehow the representation. Usually they only painted Jesus Christ, Maria, Holy Maria, and so on. They started to paint this, Venere di Botticelli. They painted human bodies. They started to paint human bodies, to refocus on human bodies. So they put the human being at the center of the universe. So far, until in the Middle Ages, at the center of the universe, there were God. Humanism started to say, let's look at human beings. And Renaissance, the previous one, the previous one was the Venere of the Botticelli. Renaissance means that to do this shift, those people at those time rediscovered the ancient civilization, rediscovered antiquity. They start to look, at the Greek world, at the Roman world, and this brought what we call a Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth after this long period of 1,000 years of Middle Ages in which only religion was important. And this will take centuries because Renaissance is in the 1500s. It's only, 300 years after that we will have another movement, political, stronger, which is the Enlightenment, which is about the same thing, which means after 300 years of fighting, we put light over superstition. So it's a long journey from Renaissance to Enlightenment. It's a very long journey. It stands for 300 years. So one point that brought us from Middle Ages to modernity is humanism and Renaissance. Where did this movement start, humanism and Renaissance?
In Fiorentina, Florence.
In Florence, yeah. In Florence. So, which very important political thinkers who we have from Florence.
Machiavelli.
Machiavelli. So Machiavelli was a part of this movement of humanism, of Renaissance, because he was in this beautiful city of Florence where he started to paint, blah, blah, blah. He was part of this intellectual movement, and his contribution was he wrote a book that separated politics from morality. So he said, politics is an independent domain that has its own laws, which are the laws of power, the laws of the interest of the state, and so these are the crucial points. So he founded modern politics as an autonomous domain by saying, yeah, in morality we think of the good, of the bad, and you always have to use good means. In politics, no, we look at power, at the exercise of power, and sometimes so you have to use means that are against the moral laws, against ethics. So, but it was also a part of this humanist and Renaissance movement because he wrote two very important books, The Prince and The Discourses on Living, in which he started to look at the ancient Roman Republic in order to think how a good republic would work. So he looked at the ancient times in order to have a Renaissance in the present times. So one thing that brings us from Middle Ages to early modernity is humanism and Renaissance. What else? Scientific revolution. But let's say so. Another thing is the discovery of the New World. We discovered that the world was much bigger than we expected. The discovery of America. So the symbolic date in which we say modernity starts is 1492, the discovery of America. Scientific revolution. First of all, Galileo Galilei is saying the universe, also not only the world is much bigger than we knew, but even the universe is much bigger than we know. And overall, is not at the center of the universe, there is not the Earth, is not us. We are just turning around the sun. So the universe is much bigger. Scientific revolution is we just mentioned Galileo Galilei, but there were many innovations. And as you know, science made new things, new ideas, but then these ideas become technologies, become technological progress, and they had this progress also about the printing. The invention of the printing, very, very important, because up to that moment, all culture were, under the church. Why? Because it was the monks, especially the Benedict monks, who copied the book and took in the libraries of the monasteries of the church. So the church had somehow the monopoly of the culture because they were doing this. But print, the invention of printing, Gutenberg, made culture, more open. Yeah. And so this also was very interesting for this for the German priest Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation. He translated the Bible from Latin to German and give it to people and say, you can also read the Bible. And then he was saying, okay, let's read the Bible all together. I don't see in the Bible that is written that the church can have indulgences. I don't find it, indulgences, because at the time, the Roman Catholic Church was saying, yeah, you can do some sins, you can be a bad Christian, so you're supposed to go to hell. But if you come here, good guy, you talk to the priest, you pray, and you pay us, we will cancel your sins and send you to heaven. This was the practice of indulgences, and Martin Luther was so angry about this, and they say, no, I don't find it in the Bible, there is not written, in the Evangel there is not written. Jesus Christ never said that, St. Paul never said that, so you corrupted, and they want a new church based on what? Based on the fact that individuals can also themselves have a relationship with God, and they don't always need the church as an intermediary. They don't always need the priest as an intermediary. So they foster this individual relationship with God, which is also a root of modern individualism, of Western societies are individualistic society, in the sense that the individual is the center of politics. The single citizen is the center of politics. Before, in the Middle Ages, communities were more important. Still nowadays, in Confucian societies like China, the society, the collective body is more important than the individual. But here in Western society, we are more focused on the individual, and Protestant society especially. Americans, Germans, the Dutch, so Northern Europe societies, they consider it to be more individualistic society, whilst here that we still, kind of Christian country in the sense of Catholicism, we still value, families very much and communities very much. So Protestant reform was huge because the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages was the most important political institution. Religion dominated politics, and so a split, when the Protestants split the Catholic Church, it was huge shift. But then it had very important political consequences, which were especially the fact that political power was supposed to originate with God's will. So it was God's decide. You were a king for the will of God, and so it was the Pope putting you the crown and say, yeah, you are the legitimate king, the legitimate sovereign. But then you have the split of the church, and you don't know anymore who can say you're the legitimate or not. So we have a long period, 100 years of religious war in Europe. And at the end of these religious wars, we had the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which we consider the emergence of the state. 1648 Peace of Westphalia, we consider the emergence of the state. But we are not courts of modern history. We are courts of the history of political thought. So we focus on thought, on concepts, on the idea that gave birth to the modern state. And so we focus on a doctrine which is called contractarianism. So it's the theories of the social contract, which is a big new thing, because this theory started to say the power, sovereignty, political power, political authority does not come from above, from God, from divine will. It comes from below, from a social contract among citizens. Big shift, big shift. And so this was the problem. Contractarianism had a problem. Say, if we don't have any more religious legitimation of the political power, we need a new form of legitimation. How can we legitimate political power? And so they invented this theory, this way of thinking, which is contractarianism. Contractarianism has two steps, always have two steps. All the thinkers in contractarianism, we focus on Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, think through two steps. Step one, nothing. What is the step one?
State of nature?
State of nature, yeah. Step two, social contract. Step one, state of nature. Step two, social contract. So all contractarians say, if we want to understand what is the legitimation, the origin of political power, we have to imagine a situation in which political power government does not exist at all. Let's try to imagine this situation. Political power does not exist at all. So we can think of the conditions to which we would accept to have a government, the conditions to which we would establish a government. And so, say, we mentioned the list of government, how would we write a contract that establishes the government? Okay, so state of nature, social contract. State of nature, it depends how you imagine political anthropology, which means how you think human beings are. Because if you think that humans are by nature bad, greedy, selfish, aggressive, and so on, you think in the state of nature is going to be war, it's going to be a lot of conflict, and so you need a very strong political power. This is Thomas Hobbes. I'm not going to repeat again Thomas Hobbes, because we say it 2 times, but so Thomas Hobbes says, state of nature, you're going to have a lot of war, conflict, homo homini lupus, war of all against all, so we need to establish a strong sovereign, the Leviathan, who monopolizes violence in order to preserve society from violence. I'm not going to get into this, but it's a very important theory because it somehow invents the principles of modern state and defines the concept of sovereignty. Second guy in contractarianism, John Locke, founding father of
modern
liberalism, Java patrician. So, founding father of liberalism. So, John Locke says, dear Thomas Hobbes, that's a great idea, a dynamic social contract, that's good. Let's establish this social contract to make a sovereign, but let's put some limits to this social contract, right? So liberalism is about limiting the power of the state, limited government. It means, it's good to have a government, but it cannot do everything at once. We have to put some limitations. And these limitations of the power, of the political power, we call it the basic principle of liberalism. How do we limit the political power of the state? By establishing
natural right?
Yes, individual rights. These rights, we can call them natural rights, citizen rights, inalienable rights, human rights, and so on and so forth. But the rights are the main principle of liberalism, which says the political power cannot touch upon the rights of the people. So the rights, individual rights, are the limitations of the power of the state. This was John Locke. So limited government, individual rights, rule of law means that even the government must, obey the law, cannot break the law, and the right to resist. If the government breaks your right, you have the right to overthrow this government. Okay, but we get back later to liberalism, because liberalism is very, very, very important political doctrine, because it's the defining political doctrine of Western civilization. Western civilization is very much focused on liberal principles, on individual rights. For example, what we nowadays call human rights, which are rights that belongs to you just because you are a human being. So it belongs to you. It cannot be violated by any regime all over the world. Every regime has to respect the human rights. That, for example, you can believe to any God that you want. That you must have the freedom of thought and freedom of speech. You should be free to think whatever you want and be able to express it. The fact that, John Locke says the 3 are freedom, life, property. Means life means that the political power cannot kill you like this one man. One day they wake up and they kill you. You have the right, to a fair process, to get to know your rights and to go in front of a judge and to have a fair trial. this freedom we already said, and then Locke also said that property which is seized as a consequence of your labor, you work, as a result of your work you get properties, and the state cannot come and take these properties from you. So these are the principles. These are the founding principles of Western civilization. Western civilization, we often describe it as liberal democracies. Liberal democracies. So it's liberalism and it's democracy. But actually, liberalism and democracy are two different principles. And nowadays, we're going to start the founding father of modern democracy, which is a French guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote a very important book named Le Contrat Social, the social contract. So he's also a contractarianist, and we consider the founding father of democracy. Is the third one, is the third contractarian that we are going to start. He was born in Geneva, 1712. So he lived after the 18th century, which is the century of the Enlightenment, okay? In 1762, he wrote the book, Le Contrat Social, and he was persecuted for religious reasons for having written this book. Okay, he was living in Geneva, so you know that Switzerland is a very special country because they still nowadays try to practice direct democracy through referendum. Geneva at the time was a city republic, so it was a very, very, very active situation. So this context helped him to think of democracy. So its main works are this. He also had other books, very important book on pedagogy, on how to teach, and so on. But what is interesting for us is le discours sur l'origine et le fondement de l'inégalité et le contrat social. These two books, we can say they are together. For me, I consider them together. Because this is the state of nature. Here he analyzes the state of nature in this book. In this book, he analyzes the social contract. So, first book we don't consider. The Discourse on the Science of the Arts is his dialogue with the Enlightenment movement who was going on. But we go to this one. Discourse of Inequality. So here it talks about state of nature. And here we have Rousseau. He has positive anthropology. It's the opposite to Thomas Hobbes. He says, Thomas Hobbes thinks if you leave human beings in the state of nature without government, without authority, without the police, without the state, without democracy, without the political control, and so on, people are going to kill each other. Homo homini lupus, they're going to act as a wolf of each one against the other one. They're going to try to steal the food and so on, and war all against all. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, no, I don't think so. I think if you leave human beings living in a savage situation, you put all of them in the jungle and so on, it's going to be good, It's going to be good. Everybody is going to, cultivate their own field and rest in the hamacas and, chill out and eat their bananas and having, good fish and having good time. It's not going to be that bad, Humans, they naturally don't want to be bothered. They don't want to bother the other people. So it has positive anthropology. People are naturally good. The natural man is similar to an animal. It's at peace due to its basic physical needs and abundance. So they say, yeah, you have the nature, it's able to give you fruits, vegetables in abundance, then you go with this. Men are equal in nature, and they want just to do good to themselves with little as possible harm to others. And they prefer to minimize the harm to others. Why should they want to harm other people? They want to minimize the harm to others. So it has this figure of the savage. So what it says, people in their natural state are basically good. Is good. So there is this idea of positive anthropology. Positive anthropology. The situation of the savages is not that bad. It's not why should people focus on harming each other when you have, freedom, big territories, abundance of the products of the nature. So there is a situation of freedom, of equality. There is no evil. People have limited reasons, limited needs. So it's not like this. So what's the problem? The problem is not that men are bad, like says Thomas Hobbes says or Machiavelli says. It's not that men are bad. The problem is that they are corrupted by the habits of society.